Okay. Good morning, everybody. This is the Ann Arbor Real Estate Investors Club multi-unit due diligence laser class. This is the first time I'm doing this class. I do another due diligence class, which is kind of more elementary and more use for single family units. But as you might imagine, there are several other moving parts involved in due diligence with a multi-unit versus a single family unit. So yeah, we're going to get going. So this is my kind of disclaimer that I use because people take a lot of classes and learn a lot of things, and a lot of the teachers paint real rosy pictures. I don't want to say anything to discourage you, but I want to be upfront that real estate is a difficult business and you will get knocked down. It's not a matter of if, it's just a matter of when and how bad. And you have to develop the resilience to get over that if you're going to be successful. I see it all the time that people have, one or two, a couple setbacks, which really, in the scheme of things are relatively small, but it causes people to quit. So I want to encourage you to stay strong. It has to do with your own fire in your own belly. But you do have a support system in this group and in me because that's what I like to do, and kind of one of the reasons I do this is to help encourage you and help you navigate through the rough spots. So that's my disclaimer. Those of you on the call who might be new, or even a reminder, the Ann Arbor Real Estate Investors Club we're about learning, networking, and deal making, which is kind of like the blood and the oxygen of the real estate business. Is you should be challenging yourself to learn something new every day. Networking, you can never have too big of a network or too strong of a network. And then obviously deals that's like the oxygen, that's like breathing, that's the business that gets everyone started and keeps everyone growing. um, get the fundamentals down. So I talk about the fundamentals, and the other reason I created this group is that it is a group that I wish had existed when I was starting out, and I didn't know anything. And I didn't know anybody, and I didn't know what I didn't know. I didn't, if somebody said, well, learn the fundamentals, Brian, I would say, well, yeah, that's great, but what are the fundamentals? I don't know what they are, but so I didn't even know what I didn't know. So I've kind of put together, my whole teaching program based around that. And this is a list of fundamentals that I have come up with based on my 21 years of experience in the real estate world. That these are the subjects that you really have to get a working knowledge of. You'll never know everything. You might not ever get comfortable in some of these topics, but if you discipline yourself to make a little bit of progress every day, you will get there and you will be successful. So these are the topics that I cover in my laser classes. So today, obviously, is due diligence in the multifamily space. So that's what I'm covering today. As we get into the new year, I'm going to be redoing a series of these classes and updating them. And the difference this year between previous years is I'm recording all of them and then uploading them to a YouTube channel, so they will be available if you take them, and if you take the class and need reference, or if you happen to miss or whatever. So that's it. So due diligence, why this class matters. Smart investors are not lucky, they're prepared. Due diligence is the most important skill to protect your capital, avoid bad deals, and uncover hidden value. So due diligence is really, where the pencil gets sharpened, where the rubber meets the road, and you know there really is no detail too small to cover in your due diligence process. And the big challenge about the whole due diligence process, and what I'm talking about today, is primarily the due diligence process, which means from the time a purchase agreement is signed until closing of a property. So that window that you are under contract. Okay, I'm going to refer to, what you can do before that time period, but that's the due diligence period. And you don't have the luxury of time because it's a finite amount of time, because it's written in the contract. And as that clock ticks, the pressure builds to put all these puzzle pieces together. So what I plan to do today is have you as prepared as you're going to be walking in. So when you're in that zone of that time period, okay, you can do it in a sequential manner. You can have things queued up that the average investor will not have queued up. And because people are so focused on getting the purchase agreement and say, well, I'll worry about the due diligence later, that I want you guys to be that much better prepared for that event and that time period. Okay. And it's important, the time period the pressure is on, obviously, because you're contractually obligated. But the other component of it is that, I'm assuming we're on the buy side today, that the seller has pulled that property off the market because he has an agreement with you and he knows you have a due diligence period. So every hour that the pressure is on you to get your due diligence done, the seller views it as, this property is on the market, and if this deal doesn't go through, every hour that it's off the market is a missed opportunity for another potential buyer. So that's the psychology on the sell side as well as the buy side. But it's very important. Don't short shift it. Don't think that a detail is too small. Don't assume anything, because that will get you in trouble. I tell you a couple of horror stories as we go along the way. But this is where the rubber meets the road, and it's the most important skill. I mean, you can analyze deals all day long, but this is where the real numbers, and everything else comes into play. All right, so I've broken today's session down for the due diligence into three main elements: the financial piece, the physical and operational piece of the property, and then legal and compliance issues, which again are pretty similar for any rental property. There's a lot of them that are similar, but there are definitely some important differences in multi-unit, and we're going to dig into that a little bit deeper as I go through the next few slides. All right. So number one is financials, and all this information on these slides is in the workbook. I'm going to try and give examples as I go through the bullet points. I'm not just going to kind of read through the bullet points and then that's that. The rent roll accuracy. So that's critical. And here's a little caveat about multi-unit properties that happens in the real world, and it happened to me on my most recent deal. For multi-unit, I represented a client. We did a 13-unit right downtown on Michigan Avenue in Ypsi. And it was, I mean, all these deals are complicated for various reasons, but rent roll accuracy. So when you're doing your analysis and when you're considering making an offer, you're going to get, ideally, you're going to get a rent roll from the seller, okay, which is typically basically an Excel spreadsheet or might be a handwritten written on a piece of paper. You never know. It depends on how good a record keeper the seller is. But that's all you're going to get. You're not going to get a copy of the leases, the actual leases, until the property is under contract. Okay, the seller's just that's just pretty standard practice that the seller is not going to share those actual leases until the property is under contract. But you're going to get those when they're under contract, or you're going to find out that there aren't leases, or oh, that lease expired a couple 3 months ago or whatever. So the number one red flag is you want to make, when you get the property under contract, you want to get a copy of those leases and go over each of those leases with a fine tooth comb, because in a multi-unit property, you might have a tenant who just moved in a month ago, and you might have a tenant who's been in there since before the current owner has owned the property. So you've got to get those, and you've got to go through them with a fine tooth comb. And obviously, kind of the most important component of it is, does the lease amount, you know, as well as security deposits and stuff like that, does that match the rent roll that you got when you were formulating the offer? Seems like elementary, but again, when someone's working under the dopamine of, all right, we're under contract, we got to get this to closing, you might kind of have a tendency to fly by doing that and just kind of assume that the rent roll is accurate with the leases. um, and that's not always the case. And I use the example of this deal that I did uh, where the seller was pretty detailed in her bookkeeping, and in her records. But once we got a copy of the leases, we saw some discrepancies in there. And the discrepancies not all, always that someone's lazy or intentionally misrepresenting. They might, enter the wrong digit when they're typing it into the spreadsheet to give you the rent roll at the beginning of the process. So, it's any number of reasons that these things could be wrong, but this is obviously critical that you got to push to get this up front, because kind of everything else will cascade off this. Obviously, you'll want to analyze the rents and how they compare to the market and all that stuff, but that's a different story. Income and expenses. This is another area where, again, the more meticulous the seller is, the more you can rely on these numbers being accurate. But quite often, especially if it's smaller, like a duplex or triplex or whatever, if it's a multi-unit like 10 units, 20 units, you know well, you never know, but the chances are that the records are a little bit more up to date and accurate, but you never know that. But income and expenses, you want to get the actual as best you can, because you want to establish a baseline. There's some things that obviously are going to be similar, like utilities, or whatever, those type of bills, tax records, and all that. Um, are they up to date on taxes? Your title company will take care of that. But you're going to want to, these are all the puzzle pieces that you're going to want to put together for the financials. Actual income, actual expenses. Yours are going to be different, but again, you want a starting point, and the best starting point is what the seller has. You're not going to use that as gospel, and you're not going to say, well, because the seller paid this, that's what I'm going to pay. All right. You've got to be skeptical. But again, it's your starting point with that. Tax records, again, obviously you want to know they're current on their taxes, or if there's anything unusual in there, your attorney and your title company will partner with you on making sure that stuff is accurate. Utility bills, you don't want to, kind of right out of the gate, if you've got a property under contract, I would, recommend you contact the utility company to see what's going on. Hey, I have, 1000 Main Street in Ypsilanti under contract. What can you tell me about it? And you gather information from there. Insurance history, same thing. Again, the insurance is different. The seller of the property you're buying, he or she might own 20 other properties. So their insurance package and all that is going to be different. This is where, you ask for the history and you may or you may not get it. And it's not that critical that you get it because yours is going to be vastly different anyway. But this is where, again, ideally, before you sign the contract, you're going to engage your insurance agent and you can say, hey, insurance agent, I'm writing an offer on 1000 Main Street. Let's get the ball rolling. If the numbers aren't real, the deal isn't real. So that's kind of goes without saying. That you can find discrepancies in this part of the due diligence process that throws a a hand grenade in the whole deal. But here's another real key is engage your power team, especially if this is your first multi-unit you're buying. But again, for any deal you're doing throughout your career, engage your power team. Talk to people from your network that you're building from being a member of this group who've done multi-unit deals, who own other properties in the area where you're under contract on this, because there's a real good chance that people in your network, oh yeah, I know that building, or oh yeah, I wrote an offer on it, or oh yeah, I was going to buy that a number of years ago, or oh yeah, I know the owner. Whatever information is out there you really don't know, but engage your team, and your team is not only other investors, but obviously your lender, your insurance agent, attorney, realtor, etc. So it's important to engage them, and don't be shy about asking for help. This is obviously a huge commitment. um, and you're not buying a multi-unit to flip it in a year or whatever. You're buying it to pretty likely hold it for 10, 20, 30 years, or pass on to future generations. So that's the financial piece, obviously important. All the three elements I talked about on the previous slide, financials, none of these are more important than the other ones. This is all real high level, very important stuff. Um, Physical, I don't want to get too much into the weeds on this. I do have a couple slides that go into detail. It is all spelled out pretty much in detail in the workbook. But the key thing I want to get you trained on is engaging your team in the process early on. Okay. Don't wait until you get something under contract before you call your insurance agent. Okay. Because deals happen slowly and then they happen quickly. And then, you might put something under contract this morning and you go call your insurance agent, and, your insurance agent is out deer hunting for the next week and it's Thanksgiving. So guess what? You're dead in the water while the clock is ticking. Okay. You've got to be as proactive and anticipatory as you can. And you can't do that if you've never done it before. Um, but I'm teaching you to do that before you've done it before. So again, uh, engage your insurance agent. When you're getting ready to write an offer, when you're analyzing a deal, call up your insurance agent. Hey, Hunter, I'm analyzing this property at 1000 Main Street. I'm looking at writing an offer. Get the ball rolling. Let's have coffee and talk about it. All right. Um, See if there's a FEMA website where your lender will tell you this, your insurance agent will tell you this. There's a FEMA website you can go on and type the address of the property. You can find out if it's in a flood zone or whatever. They will do that, but again, it's something that it's a piece of the puzzle that needs to be done. Perhaps you can do it, but and be aware of it. The other thing about the FEMA website, if you've ever dealt with it before, you'll know, and people will tell you, well, it's not very accurate. So I can't vouch for the accuracy or inaccuracy of the FEMA site itself. But again, this is something that your lender is more well versed in, and your insurance agent is more well versed in this part of the transaction. So you don't really need to go down that rabbit hole as long as you can hand that ball off to your power team and say, hey, hey Joe, hey Hunter, did you check the FEMA? Yeah, I checked it out, blah, 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 whatever it is. Um, Disclosures, sellers disclosures. So again, this is an area where you're going to want to be in tune to what type of a landlord and what type of an owner your seller was. Are they meticulous? Is the building well maintained, in good shape? Has it deteriorated? Whatever, wherever it is on the spectrum of condition, and how good or bad, or where in the middle that current seller is. You want to tune into that as much as you can and review the disclosures. So I have this other deal that's going on where it's an estate sale. So it's being sold by a trustee of the bank and the heirs to this property, who are spread all around all around the country. So they don't know anything about the property, and the previous owner didn't plan on dying, so there aren't any real records of the condition of the mechanicals, the roof, the appliances, all that stuff. Review what you get. And again, the operative mantra that we do is trust but verify. So you're going to take the information that you get and use it as a starting point, but don't take it as the gospel. You can kind of reasonably assure that maybe things are all right if the owner is real meticulous and they say, oh yeah, I just replaced uh, the dishwasher in unit 4B or whatever. You can you can learn that accordingly. There's an environmental issue that comes into play where, again, this is where I'm not an expert in this area at all. So I rely on my power team to handle this aspect of the transaction. Is that lenders often require, or insurance agents often require, or a title company, in order to get title insurance, will often, but not, I thought it was always, I don't know if it's always or not always. Things change, with regulations and different companies and things. But you're going to have to pretty well figure that you're going uh, to have some sort of an environmental test on the property. Whatever that means, you find out from them and you say, hey, insurance agent, Brian told me I'm going to need an environmental test. What do I have to do? Because again, the lender and the insurance agents are on the front lines of stuff like this, the environmental stuff, the floodplain stuff, anything that impacts their aspect of the transaction. They're more at the front lines of it than your realtor like me, or any realtor, or that you can be, because you're not doing that every day. Your insurance agent, your lender, that's what they're doing every day. You know, I'm showing properties every day. So I'm not worried about, I'm not as worried about this because I know that I have my power team to take care of this. All right. Um, Inspect every unit. So here's something with this 13 unit deal I did not too long ago. I represented the buyer, He did not inspect every unit when during the due diligence process. I said, don't you want to do that? Seller said, don't you want to do that? I got all the master keys. My buyer said, no, I'm going to spot check a few of them, and I'm going to do the basement and that, and I don't need to do the other ones. So that again, he's the buyer. He's the now the new owner. That's his choice. But I'm going to tell you not to do it that way, but you can do it however you want because you're the boss. Inspect every unit, learn about all the systems and structure, the foundation, the plumbing, electrical, HVAC. A lot of multi units are older. This building was over 100 years old. So there was a lot of good and a lot of not so good in that. So get familiar with this stuff. As you're learning, when I say something, learn something new every day, learn about electrical systems, HVAC systems, landscaping, pests, radon, mold, etc. Um, Doris, I see you raised your hand. If you can hang on to the question or type it into the chat, I'll do it afterwards because there's a chance I might answer it in the next couple slides. So it kind of throws me off a little bit if you don't mind. But I definitely will answer whatever questions you have on the back end. Um, Environmental sewer scope is important, often overlooked. And especially if you've never done this before, somebody says, "Oh, are you getting a sewer scope? What do you mean?" When I heard of it first, I never would have thought of it. Number one, and until I thought of it, or until something bad happens. But now, you're going to want to. You're as part of any inspection, you're going to want to incorporate a sewer scope into your inspection process. Um, Pests are a big thing, especially when it comes to tenants, because pests might be attracted by a tenant who is in a situation. Yeah, I had a I had a 4 unit in also in Ipsy a couple years ago where um, my client only owned the property. He only owned the property for about 3 years, but he bought the property. He did not inspect every unit. This was 4 units, and we're selling the building. We got it under contract, and I said, "Hey, uh, we couldn't show this unit because of the tenant during the process. We were able to get the property under contract without showing that unit. We showed the other 3." And then what's going on? Well, she's difficult to deal with and blah, blah, blah. And then I come to find out I didn't know until after we had it under contract. My seller says, "Brian, I've never been in that unit. I don't know what's going on in there." And I'm like, I took a deep breath. You've owned the property 3 years. You've never set foot inside this unit. Okay, what are we dealing with? So we had to get into the unit for the inspection, and so we get into the unit, and it was a hoarding situation, one of the worst I've ever seen. I've seen a lot of bad ones. This one was not the worst, but it was in the team photo. And there's hoarding situations where it's just junk, but there's other hoarding situations where you know I'm not going to describe it on an early Saturday morning, but suffice it to say, there were a lot of bugs and pests in that property that other tenants were complaining about. My seller said, "Well, I don't know where it's coming from," but he had never set foot in the unit of the building that he owned for 3 years. He never set foot in it. So anyway, so that happened. So inspector comes in, a laundry list of pests. He's got, You've got ants, you've got cockroaches, you've got mice, you've got rats, and they're crawling through the building. It was horrible. It was horrible. So again, that you've got to know up front. And this was a situation, you know, again, the seller didn't even do his own due diligence. The buyer was not expecting, but the buyer was a savvy investor, and the buyer was prepared for the worst. So it was a lot worse than we thought it was, but he was prepared for it. And you need to be prepared for it, but you can't be prepared for it unless you're experienced or you learn it today. Um, radon mold, the water meter setup. Okay. This is where you're going to call the utilities. So not only the electrical, you're going to want to call the water department and say, hey, I have this property under contract. What's the metering setup? And ideally, if it's a multi-unit, ideally you'd like to have a meter on every unit, but you may not have that. So you might only have one meter. So you're going to have to figure out how to prorate that out to the tenants and all that. You need to figure all that out, again, under a time constraint of the due diligence period. Um, utility deposits. Okay, this is something that's like, oh yeah, by the way, oh yeah, I forgot about that, or oh yeah, by the way, the perhaps if it's a landlord that didn't take care of the property, maybe 10 years ago they didn't pay the bill on time and they had to put a deposit up, to keep the water going. And so again, that the utility deposit is something that your title company should find out about, but you're going to want to be aware of it because that's something that it's potentially a negotiable thing. But you likely would have to reimburse the seller for that deposit amount. But that might be, if it's $1,000 or $5,000 or whoever what knows what it is, the utility company might require you to put that up again. Who knows? You need to find that out. Service agreements. This is again, this happened on this 13 unit I did. Is there were a couple different service agreements over the years with a company that did the HVAC, a company that serviced the appliances, things like that. This 13 unit, it was a probate situation where the owner passed away relatively suddenly, and his wife took over, and there were service agreements in place that her husband had signed that she didn't know about, and stuff was being deducted from their account on a regular basis and all that stuff. So those may be in place or they may not be in place. You got to find out about it. Those are not necessarily going to transfer over. um, but they might, and you might have an obligation there that you need to get out of, or you need to release, or if it's a company that does a good job and knows the mechanical system of the building already because they've been servicing it for years, maybe you want to keep that service agreement or extend it. Okay, those type of things, again, that's all in the workbook here. um, are the type of things that you need to worry about. And again, these are questions that you can have queued up. So when you put pen to paper on the contract, okay, here's my checklist. Boom, boom, boom. You're gonna send, you're gonna send likely your realtor, hey, Brian, here's my punch list of stuff that I need right now. And if you've been working with your realtor already knows this. He doesn't, obviously, he's not going to find out after you sign the contract. You're going to have it queued up. All right. Service records, ages of appliances. This again is a big one, and I see it all the time. That investors don't look at this. Um, and especially, if you're taking over, if it's 6 units or 10 units or 20 units, you know, I'm going to put together a spreadsheet of all the appliances in all the units, and how old they are, so you can determine what their lifespan is. Okay, so for example, a refrigerator or a stove or whatever might have if you're lucky, might have an 8-year lifespan. Okay, so you're going to put together a spreadsheet with those timelines so you can plan accordingly, because 1 month there might be 4 dishwashers that break, or another month there might be none, and you're going to want to get in front of that type of stuff, um, as best you can, and that you're only going to learn by doing, because that kind of stuff will eat up your reserve fund in short order. And that's something, if the dishwasher breaks, you can live with it for a little while. But if the stove breaks or the refrigerator breaks, washer and dryer breaks, you got to replace those pretty quickly. Otherwise, you're in violation of the terms of the lease, and that is a road that nobody wants to go down to. So again, the key point I'm making is to be as proactive as you can about this type of stuff. And it's hard to do, and it takes time, and it's boring, and it's not exciting, but it's really gotta be done. All right. Physical and operational. All right. Validate occupancy. Again, we're talking about, you've got to gauge the seller on the spectrum of how attentive he or she may or may not be. You might have a 10-unit building with an absentee owner, and you might have squatters in a couple of the units that you don't know, that they don't have leases. So you need to validate. It kind of should go without saying. And if you've never done it before, you assume, oh, well, the person that's in there is the one that's on the lease. All right. Well, that may or may not be true, and you will probably be, unpleasantly surprised more often than not that, maybe there's a squatter in there, or the guy that signed the lease a year ago moved out and let his cousin move in. I won't say I've seen it all, because the minute I say I've seen it all, I see something different today. Um, yeah, so I had another situation on a property in Ipsy where that exact scenario happened. Guy signed the lease, lived there for a few months, got a job somewhere else, um, and just let his cousin move in. The owner didn't know, because the owner is not a hands-on owner. The owner had the owner, in this case, the owner had a manager, um, and the manager was not hands-on. So the owner's dependent on the manager. Manager drops the ball. Tenant who's on the lease uh, lets his cousin move in. Okay. The cousin moves in, stays there. I don't know whether or not the rent kept getting paid, but after a while it wasn't paid. And then what's going on? Well, now the cousin moves out and lets a friend of theirs who was homeless move in, because now he's not paying the rent anyway. Okay. Homeless person moves in and is in there a month or 2 months or whatever. Manager has dropped the ball, so the owner doesn't know. Finally, the owner says, "What the hell's going on?" "Oh, well, yeah, this guy's been in there 3 months. You can't get him out," because now the homeless guy says, "Well, yeah, I got the permission of the owner, because I've been living here for 3 months." So it took the owner 6 or 8 months to get the guy evicted and go through the eviction, all the expense, and then, as you might imagine, the place was trashed and all that stuff. So this is stuff that again, you wouldn't think of it because you don't know. So you assume, well, the person who's in there is the one who's on the lease. No, you got to validate that. Any unusual lease terms, all right? Well, I give this guy $100 off the rent because he cuts the grass for me. That those type of things. Um, there could, again, you want when you see the copy of the leases, you'll know. But leases could be handwritten. Again, it could be something from 20 years ago. You don't know. Tenant behavior. This is something I'm going to do that I don't know why my client. I told my client, do this, do this, do. You ought to do this. Oh, it'll be all right. Don't worry. Okay. Well, if you're not worried about it, I'm not gonna. I'm not gonna. I got enough things of my own to worry about. But when I get copies of those leases, I'm gonna, I'm not. I'm gonna use my screening service, to maybe run some checks on these people because again, they might be great, but if someone's been in there 1 year, 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, their circumstances may change, personally or whatever. Um, I'm going to want to do background checks on them. I'm going to look up their Facebook profile. I want to know who these tenants are that I'm inheriting, okay? Because I want to be proactive and I want to get ahead of any potential problems or as much as I can. Now, you have to honor the leases if it's a valid lease. You have to honor it, okay? You can't find something out about this tenant and then just kick them out, you know, unless it violates the terms of the lease. They still have a lease. And if it's a written lease and if it's a valid lease, you have to honor it for that term. But, you certainly don't have to renew it. But that's what I'm going to do. As part of my due diligence, if I haven't done it before, I'm going to want to talk to the tenants. I mean, you might be I'm in a situation now where the seller says, Brian, I want to sell the building, but I don't want the tenants to know. Okay, well, that's his prerogative because that's a natural part of the process when you're buying a multi-unit is if the tenants know the building is for sale, maybe a good tenant will move out. They'll think something bad's going to happen and cause problems, and which does happen. So you've got to navigate, those landmines. All right. But as best you can, even, when you have it when it's under contract, then you have the opportunity, I'd like to meet the tenants. I'd like to talk to them, introduce myself and whatever. Maintenance history, you want to find out again if the person who has been taking care of the property is just the guy in the lower unit who the seller gave him a cut of the rent and he fixes stuff up, but he's a handyman and perhaps he's not licensed, and who knows how much he knows or doesn't know, or if he cobbles stuff together, or if he does a good job, or what. You don't know any of that stuff. Deferred maintenance. Again, this is, how old is the roof? How old are the mechanical systems? What are you going to be your CapEx needs? And it means capital expenditure. I use CapEx because it wouldn't fit on the slide. Capital expenditure, and you have to say to yourself, I'm planning, when I did my analysis, I'm planning on owning this building for at least 20 years. All right. So if I'm going to own the building for at least 20 years, I can imagine that, there's a real good chance within that 20-year period, I'm going to have to get a new roof. I'm going to have to get new HVAC. I'm going to have to get a new furnace, at least once during that 20-year period. Is that going to be now or a year from now or maybe 15 years from now? But you want to have that on your radar screen because, we all know that time passes and, You wake up your one morning and you say, "Oh yeah, I need a new roof." You bought the building and the new roof was in great shape, and the roof was in great shape when I bought it. Well, yeah, that was 15 years ago. Where did the time go? And that's, we all know that. Um, that's the physical and operational stuff. All right, inspecting the unit, getting to know the mechanicals, learning about electricity, learning about plumbing, learning about all the stuff you may or may not know about. But now that you're in a multi-unit with a 10 or 20 unit building, you're in the big leagues, and all the expenses you have with a single family home, they don't multiply in necessarily in relation to the number of units, but they multiply in an exponential type of way, that you've got to have a lot more stuff on your radar screen, than you do with a single family, or even, with five or six different single families, or whatever. All right, legal and compliance. So again, uh, when you're thinking about writing an offer, part of your power team is engaging the title company. All right, you're going to want to talk to the seller, have your realtor talk to the seller. Okay, Mr. Seller, what title company are you using? And then you, as the buyer, you don't have to use the title company that the seller is using. You get to choose your own title company. That's part of the legal process. So once you're a seasoned investor, you have a title company who you've worked with, on previous deals. And if you like them, continue. If you don't, find another one. But again, you're going to want to engage your title company right out of the gate, even before you have an accepted offer. So it's on their radar screen, and they can do some preliminary work, like their own version of title research and things like that. Because you'll find situations, I mean, with any property, not only multi-unit property, where there's problems with the title work, or, especially if it's an owner who's owned it for a long time, especially if it happen to be a probate situation, or even, it doesn't even have to be a foreclosure situation, that, a seller may have taken out loans over the years that haven't paid off. They may have engaged with workers over the years that they didn't pay, or what, you never know. That's where your title company comes into play. That's where they do their job. But again, you've got to, you're, it ultimately the buck stops with you. So, you can't 100% rely on everybody, because if something blows up, it's, you know, ideally you're covered by the title company, you're covered by the insurance and all that stuff, but it's going to come blow back to you, because the buck stops with you. Um, Check the zoning, work permits. Here's another big thing, especially, this 13 unit is a 100-year-old building. Who knows what kind of work has been done on the building over the last 100 years? During the due diligence period, you're going to want to go to the building department, plunk yourself down, bring a dozen donuts to the people who work in the building department and say, "Hey, I've got 1000 Main Street under contract. What can you tell me? What can you tell me about?" They may have a whole book of violations, or, work that's been done but not permitted, and you never know what can of worms you may or may not be opening, but you want to open that can of worms sooner rather than later. And that's real. That's critical. And this is going to be, again, each municipality, where a property is, their building departments, work different, operate differently, have different requirements, different standards, different records. Some may be online. You may buy a property in a township where the building department, there's only someone in the office, between 9 and noon every other Wednesday. You never know any of that stuff. But again, those are all things that got to be on your radar screen for you to be proactive about. And again, it might be something, that might be something that you do before you have an accepted offer, that you walk into the building department, introduce yourself. If you're an experienced investor and have been investing in the area anyway, there's a good chance you've been in the building department before and you maybe know the people there already and have a good contact that can help you out. But again, this is where again you check back with the building department, with your insurance agent, with your lender, with your power team, with other investors who have had similar experiences, with your realtor, etc. Here's where you want to get familiar with landlord tenant laws. And again, whatever municipality you get into, these are going to be different. I talk about this in a property management class, which I'll have in a few weeks. Um, Landlord tenant, there's federal laws, there's state laws, and there's local laws. There's three different sets of laws you got to be aware of as an owner and a landlord. So it's not, oh yeah, why I know the landlord tenant laws, I know the federal laws. Well, wait, time out. Yeah, that's nice, but this is something that you never know if you don't know. Holy cow, there's three different sets of laws. Sometimes those laws conflict with each other. All right. You'll be scratching your head about that, but that's another issue. Um, any local compliance issues, etc. That's stuff that's all part of your due diligence that you can find out. You can find out tons of valuable stuff in your trip to the building department. All right. Um, Here I've been talking about those main three components. Um, and here is another key that took me quite a while to learn, and I learned it the hard way. So hopefully now you won't have to learn it the hard way the way I learned it. Is the concept of control. Okay, so there is due diligence that you can do and that you should do up to a point before you have control. But control is when pen goes to paper and buyer and seller have a live purchase agreement in effect and the clock is ticking on the due diligence period. That's control. When the seller signs that purchase agreement, that means that the buyer now controls what happens to that property, whether he buys it or doesn't buy it, but that's now the buyer's decision. The seller is giving up his control when he signs that purchase agreement. All right. So there's stuff that you want to do before that happens and stuff to do after that happens. And obviously, the key is you're not going to want to spend actual, real, hard earned money out of pocket, on things like inspections, sewer scopes, you know, estimates, things like that, if you don't have control, okay, because the seller can change his or her mind at any given moment. Another buyer could come in that the seller decides to sign a purchase agreement with, etc. So again, it sounds elementary, but it's not elementary, and you have to follow the contract. So the line that I draw of what due diligence to do before you have control versus after control is I'm not going to spend any actual green dollars out of pocket until the point that I have control of that property. Okay, that's the line I draw. Again, you're the CEO of your own business, so you can do it with it as you wish. So, what can I do before control? And in this again, this is going to take time, effort. It might take some expense, some incidental expense that you do anyway. Um, and you're going to have to decide is how much time out of your life do you want to invest in this if you don't have control of the property. So that's another executive decision you're going to want to make. But here's stuff that you can do before you have control of the property. All right, you can get disclosures, you can tour the property, you can do online research about the property. Google if there's been crimes at the property, whatever. County records, building departments, permits, the floodplain stuff. Tap into your network. Hey, again, I'm going to repeat myself from the earlier slide about that. Do that. Pre-title report. This is where, you can get in trouble, but you can do this because your title company will do the preliminary work before you get it under contract. So you're going to want to, this again, I learned it the hard way by touching the stove and getting burned when I should have known the stove had the burner going, is verify that the person you're going to sign the contract with is the person who's the owner or has the authority to sign it. Don't just sign the contract and then do this work. All right. Again, proactive. Step 6, line up your inspectors. Okay. Hey, Kyle, I'm getting ready to buy this property. I'm getting ready to put it under contract. What's your schedule like? Kyle says, Brian, it's Thanksgiving. I'm deer hunting for the next 2 weeks. Okay. You want to know that now before you put pen to paper. All those kind of stuff. Same thing with contractors. You call up a contract. I have this situation going on right now for a roof. We called a roofer. He goes, Brian, I'm booked out for 3 weeks. I can't even look at it for another 3 weeks. Okay. That you've got to know, you want to know that going in because again, once pen goes to paper, the clock is ticking and you can't have a contract and say, oh, my roofer's not available for 3 weeks. The seller's not going to wait around. The seller's going to say, figure it out, once the pen has gone to paper. All right. After control. All right. Now here's where, you get your Venmo card out and you're going to want to get a sewer scope. That's depending on where it is. That's a few $100 right out of the gate. Inspection. This is where money is going to be spent. Inspections are getting, I mean, everything in this world is getting more expensive. Sewer scopes are more expensive. Inspections are more expensive. Contractor estimates, if there's work that needs to be done, is more expensive. Unless you have a really good relationship with a contractor, they're going to charge you. They're going to say, Brian, I'm happy to come out and look at the chimney, but I'm going to charge you $400 to come and take a look. If the deal goes through and you hire me to fix it, I will credit you the 400, so the estimate doesn't cost you anything. But these are some real slap in the face realities about money that you're going to have to put out of pocket. And again, you have control, but you don't own the building yet. So again, appraisals, all of that stuff. After you have control, after you go through your due diligence, that's when you engage in the whole process of renegotiating the contract based on what you found in your due diligence. All right. You might have a laundry list of, 100 items, who knows? And obviously, as the buyer, you're going to want as much of that to be taken care of or by the seller or credited to you in the form of a reduced price or whatever. Seller's going to do it or not do it, again, based on do they have another buyer queued up on their side. I'm going through that right now. I just was renegotiated a deal. We were back and forth. We were $75,000 apart on the renegotiation, and sellers wanted to meet halfway, this and that. My buyer said, I'm sorry, no, this is it. We're prepared to walk away. we have the leverage because we are, again, it's the bird in the hand. Okay. Seller doesn't have the leverage because they don't have another buyer in the wings. So they're faced with, are they going to let this buyer walk? And then they're going to have monthly expenses, holding costs all through the winter. And God knows what's going to happen in the spring. So they accepted our offer. It's a buyer's market now. So all of those, all of those moving parts come into play. But if it's a popular building, in the case of this 13 unit, it was a popular building. There were a couple other offers on the table. We didn't have a lot of room to renegotiate. We did do some renegotiation, and you want to do again, renegotiation. You want to renegotiate based on stuff that any buyer is going to ask for, okay, or what you reasonably judge that any buyer is going to ask for. There's a whole list of other stuff that comes into play, but that's come to my negotiation class, and I'll talk more about that because I could go on for that for about an hour. Closing date is one of the again, one of the negotiating tools. But that's what you negotiate after control. You say, all right, I've had my inspector in. Inspector says, you should have a plumber come and look at this, or you should have an electrician come in this. So you might need to extend the inspection period so you can get the contractors in. That's exactly what I'm going through right now on another deal, and it's very common. All right. Now, when your due diligence discovers issues, which you're going to discover issues, it's just a matter of what they are, how bad they are. Are they bugs on the windshield, or is it a boulder in the front seat of your car as that somebody threw off the bridge on the expressway? So you're going to want to evaluate, and again, engage your power team. Engage your advisors. You shouldn't do this in a vacuum on your own. Um, go back to your deal analysis of analyzing how you analyze the deal in the first place, and again, your exit strategy. Likely, these are properties you're going to own for a lifetime, and maybe a couple generations of your family's lifetime. All right, so your exit strategy comes into play regarding the issues of the due diligence. Are there a lot of capital expenditure expenses up front? Like I say, the way I think of it, if I'm going to own a property for 20 years, I know I'm going to have to replace the roof at some point in that 20 years. It's just a matter of when. It's not if, it's when. So I now know that up front. So if it needs a new roof now, well, okay, it needs a new roof now, then I don't need another one for 20 years or whatever. But those are the factors that come into play. You can use any of those elements in the renegotiation, but the thing is, when you find due diligence and there's lots of problems, you know, again, you're the CEO. You can walk away right now, get your earnest money back, shake hands, thank you, sorry, good luck. But the property might still be worth pursuing if the seller is willing to make concessions. And so that's when, again, just like I said on the previous slide, that's where the market conditions come into play. And that's where the motivation of the seller comes into play. So this is stuff that you have to do on the fly, but I teach it kind of, try and think of it like a chess game. What's the circumstances of the seller as to what you can what you can reasonably negotiate with or not, and then you'll ultimately, if you're a smart investor, which all you guys are because you're on here, you're a smart investor. Um, you're going to have your walk away number. You're going to have your number where you say, all right, Brian, send me the mutual release. I'm out of here. We've reached the end of it. So that's what I did. That's what I did this week. I sent the mutual release, and sellers goes, "Well, I thought you wanted to renegotiate." I said, "No, this is it. I'm sorry. We're that's it." And Then they came back. They didn't send the mutual release. Sometimes you need that mutual release to be put in front of them for the seller to say, well, wait a second, time out. This is the best I'm gonna do, a bird in the hand. And now the buyer has invested a couple $1,000s in inspections and appraisals and all that. The buyer now has skin in the game. The buyer knows now, you as the buyer, you likely know more about the property than the seller knows about the property, and you still want to go ahead with it, but he's got to make concessions. Okay, so that's how that comes into play. Um, what type of inspections are you talking about, Brian? All right, I'm repeating myself here. This kind of a review part of the slide because I'm over my time limit, but um, I talk about the physical of the property with any property. The big six are, the roof, the foundation, the plumbing, the electrical, the HVAC, and the landscaping. Does the basement flood? How's the drainage? Um, Sewer scope, pests, radon, flood, environmental, non-permitted work. If there's been work that's been, ideally the building has a certificate of occupancy, but even with that, it depends on the locality, and there's a lot that goes into that. But sometimes there's been non-permitted work that has been done that's never been fixed, and it might be a condition of the sale, whatever, that you might have to have the non-permitted work that's been done be done in the correct way. There might not be a problem, but it just wasn't permitted. But anyway, that's all this type of stuff is on your radar screen, etc. Now you say, Brian, what's my power team? What's a power team? What do you need? Um, Again, you've been in this long enough. If you've been in longer than a minute, you need realtors, attorneys, insurance, inspection, title companies. You need a roofer, you need a plumber, you need people on call, you need a handyman, you need carpenter, you need a CPA, you need a financial planner. Uh, if you're not if when you're purchasing a new asset, especially, these multi-unit properties are not cheap, so it's a substantial asset. You need to update your will or have a will, get a will. Okay, what happens if you buy it today and you die tomorrow, or you die 20 years from now? Whatever. I'm teaching you to be proactive and think proactive. All right. Um, Title insurance, closing docs, etc. Get familiar with all that stuff. Again, that's not my area of expertise. I know enough about these things to be dangerous, but I also know enough to rely on the specialists in this area as my power team to cover all the stuff that I could not possibly know. Okay. That's your time. When you get to this point, it's your attorney, it's your title company, it's your lender, it's your insurance agent, it's your financial planner, it's your CPA. Those are 6 people on the power team. You got to engage with them right now. Hey, this is going, this train is leaving the station, um, etc. That goes without, I mean, it should go without saying, but this is a lot of stuff. And if you've never seen or heard this before, you're saying, holy crap, Brian, that's a lot of stuff. And yeah, it's a lot of stuff. You're buying a multi-unit property, chances are it's in the 7 figures, um, if not close to it, or will be at some point. So this is the big leagues. This isn't a $60,000, property in Inkster. Um, this is the big leagues. And and any of these elements, you're juggling, you drop the ball on any of these, and it's a pretty big gut punch. All right. That's the end of my presentation on the due diligence. So this is how I bring the train into the station. We've got a month of the holidays coming. I encourage you, learn every day. and read a book. Don't just scroll, don't just scroll stuff or YouTube videos and do it, the easy way. Um, buy a book, buy a book, a 300-page book. You read 10 pages a day. You've read it in a month. Okay. It's a little bit each day. You learn something each day. This is my favorite book for real estate investors. It's just a personal favorite. Here's another one I'm recommending, Build a Rental Property Empire by Mark Ferguson. It's very tragic. He just recently passed away. But this is a great book. You know, buy yourself these books for Christmas and get a cup of tea and sit by the fireplace when the weather gets bad and read these books. Upcoming events. Here's four events upcoming. AI for investors. I've done a couple of these sessions. I'm doing updates, and there's a few other people that come to our Rainmakers group that are really using AI in a big way in their investment business. And it's the term game changer kind of gets thrown around, but AI for real estate investing really is a game changer. And again, I'm going to invite you to join us and get on the front end of it, rather than the back end. I'm going to do a couple Zoom classes, foreclosures, wholesaling. Probably the one after that will be property management. And then I'm going to tick through, that fundamental list that I told you at the top, as well. If you find value in what I do, I don't have dues. I don't charge by the meeting, stuff like that. Um, if you find value in what I do, if you become a regular member of the group, I think you'll find value. I ask for a one-time membership fee to kind of demonstrate your appreciation, of $150 one time, lifetime, because I can't keep track of monthly stuff and I don't want to collect $10 a month from people or whatever. Um, but I do have expenses and my time does have value. So if you're inclined, I'd appreciate that. And that's it for the end. That's the end of today. What I am going to do is stop the share, stop the recording.